Okay, second go. Morning, guys. It's great to be here. I was last here many years ago. I actually worked here I worked here for 16 years at CSIR, which is probably the longest I've ever been anywhere. I feel like a bit like a preacher in a church today with an empty front row. But more importantly, I think over the years, speaking about digitalization, just like preaching in a church, it's more about faith than fact. And I think up until recently, talking about digitalization has been pretty much more about faith than fact. But over the last few years, everybody, I think, sees it. Everybody says this is definitely, this isn't sci-fi anymore, it's real. So what I try to do is I say, I'm not about predicting the future. It's not to say, yeah, we know there'll be 50 billion connected devices in 2020 and 7 billion people connected to the internet, etc., etc. We know that. The question is, what does it mean? Now, normally I go around speaking to business people about it, and it's about how do they make sense of digitalization and how should they craft a strategy about where to play and how to win. I'm tweaking that a little bit to have a slightly higher, sort of more industry level focus. So here goes. Let's see how it goes. I think the first thing that most people ask me is, is it going to affect me? Yeah, we all know that record companies have been disrupted and Kodak's been disrupted, but is it going to affect me? And the place to start is what I call Economics 101. Let's look at industry structure. And it says, yeah, if you're in primary industries, so agriculture, mining, oil, gas, the extractive industries, you're at a relatively lower level of threat of being disrupted. If you're in the secondary industries, manufacturing, processing, beneficiation, and so on, you're at a higher level of being disrupted, a higher risk of being disrupted. Once you start getting to the tertiary industries, service industries like retail, financial services, then the risk of being significantly disrupted is getting high. And of course, when you get to what is now being pulled out of the tertiary sector and known as the quaternary sector, the knowledge sector of the economy, you're at an extreme level likelihood of being disrupted if you haven't been already. So that's things like R&D, legal services, education, healthcare, the diagnostic side of healthcare. And the thing is, it's tempting with this, and you think, oh, it's only those guys at the top of the pyramid that are therefore at risk. But the problem is the South African economy, looks like this. Let me go back one. So it's actually overwhelmingly weighted towards the top of that. That's the South African economy. People might think, oh, that looks like the OECD countries. No, that's the South African economy. And then if we overlay that risk profile on top of this, the lower ones are at lower risk, but we see that 2/3 of the South African economy is at a very high risk of being disrupted, and another quarter is at a significant risk of being disrupted. So the short point about this is that the majority of the South African industry is facing significant disruption over the next 5 to 10 years. So there's nowhere to hide. Okay, so then the question is, what Hina mentioned earlier, so let's try and make some sense of what is this thing called digitalization? Why is it so disruptive? Is it just about the technology? And my thesis is a bit different. This is quite intermittent, so I don't know if it's a battery or maybe I'm just impatient, but my belief is, okay, I must just be patient, I've been told. My wife tells me the same thing, by the way. My view is that proper innovation and change happens when previously different things come together. So the examples I use is when water and hydrogen come together, you get water. When fuel and heat and oxygen come together, you get fire. When man and woman come together, you get love. And when sperm and egg come together, you get life. When, some of you might know my background, when blues and gospel come together, you get rock and roll. So you get, when different things come together, you get really powerful change. And I think it's the same with digitalization. The tech is really important. And blockchain, mobility, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, machine learning, virtual reality, I could go on and on and on. These are really important. They underpin this whole phenomenon that we're seeing. But I would argue this phenomenon of digitalization is not only, and perhaps not even primarily, about the tech. it is equally about the way our society and our market is transforming. That we all want instant on services. We all want things personalized. We all want service on demand. We all want zero touch. Millennials just want it more than the rest of us. Everybody's going social. We're all getting active citizenships and active customership. So the way society is changing is as big. And I would argue that Facebook and Twitter and Instagram are more about changing society than the tech. The tech is good, but it's actually more about the changing society. And then there's the third critical ingredient, and that's the way business is changing. That we now have crowdsourcing and platform business models and virality and whole new ways of digital marketing. And again, let's take some of the classic examples. Airbnb is more about the business model, as is Uber. And we could carry on. So this digital phenomenon, I said intersections are so important. The reason this digital transformation we're seeing is so powerful, it's built on the tech, but it's intersecting with society and it's intersecting with the way business is changing. And that's why it's transforming the world. Now, it's all good and well to say, okay, so that's what it is. These are some of the dimensions of what it is. But what business people then ask me, so that's cool, but that doesn't help me craft a strategy to respond. So I need to we South Africans, we love sporting metaphors, so I'm going to branch into a sporting metaphor, which I must confess, I first saw this with McKinsey. I didn't pay 1.6 billion rand for it, but I think it's a good metaphor, and at the bottom it says money. Why does Roger Federer make so much money? And we'd all have our theories about why he makes so much money. And the question I'd asked, would it be the same if he played badminton? And of course the answer is no. So why does Roger Federer make so much money? The answer is, firstly, it comes down to two factors. Firstly, it's about the game you choose to play. Tennis is 14 times more lucrative than the average of all racket sports put together. So badminton, squash, table tennis, etc., etc. So picking the right game that you play is really important. The second reason Roger Federer makes so much money is he competes much better. That 14 is the average earning of the top 10 tennis players in 2015. The $57 million was Roger Federer's earnings. So if you think from a business strategy, it's the same. Business strategy is the same as this metaphor. It's about picking the right game to play and then playing that game better than everybody else. Now, let's focus a little bit on where to play, and I'm going to go into 4 areas that I think are relevant at an individual business level as well as at an industry level. The first thing is the game you play does matter. So if you look at the average economic profit of a whole lot of different industries, this was over 3,000 companies in about 150 different industries. You see that some companies like wireless, telecoms, and pharmaceuticals have a propensity to make good economic profits. And others like airlines and electric utilities, aka SAA and Eskom, struggle to make good economic profits. So the game you play really matters. It doesn't mean you can't make a profit here. It just means you've got to be that much better than the other guys to make a profit. So the game at a broad industry sector does matter. But what's actually where things get really interesting is when we look at individual company growth. So that McKinsey, which is where I first saw this, they did this study of the top 200 European and US growth companies. And on average, these companies grew by 8.6% per year for a sustained period of, I think, 6 years or something, which is pretty good growth. But what's interesting is, where did that come from? 5.5%, 2/3 of it almost, came from the growth of the segments they were in. It's just they were in wireless telecoms, wireless was growing, so they grew. They were in pharmaceuticals, pharmaceuticals were growing, so that's why they grew. Then another third of the growth, 3%, came from buying it, mergers and acquisitions. What's actually shocking, particularly for people in sales, is that only 0.1% came from increasing market share. So it says, guys, pick the right portfolio of places where to play as the primary thing about where to grow. And I believe that applies as much at an economic level, at an industry level, as it does at a business level. So if South African industry collectively chooses the wrong portfolio of industries to be in, the South African economy will not grow. We need to pick the right portfolio. What's actually important about this is we've got to do it at the right level. So the industry is divided into, the World Bank divides the global economy into 11 sectors, 24 industry groups, 68 industries, 157 sub-industries, and thousands of segments. And what's really interesting here is that when we looked at those 200 companies and their growth, there was absolutely no correlation to that. All the growth came from making the right choices at the segment level. So for example, another thing that some of you who might know about my background, I quite like wine. There's only two segments of the global wine industry that are growing. One is sparkling wine. The other, just another useless piece of takeaway information, is rosés, interestingly. But it's that sort of level. If you want to say, I'm going to get growth out of the sector I choose, you've got to go down to that level of granularity. So, lesson 1 in where to play, find the right high growth segments. But how do we find these? That's the question. Now, as many of you know, once upon a time I was a technologist, which then became a businessman that's now become an academic. So bear with me while I build up this idea of the tech space that many of us are used to. And in about this world that we now call tech started around 1900 with the first mass adoption of telephony. And then that was it for 70 years. Until in the early 70s, we got the mass adoption of IT infrastructure and applications, computers, and the programs that ran on them. And then once we had enough computers in the 80s, the data networking era was born, and we had these fixed data networks. And then, of course, we got lots of these computers, and they found their way onto our desks, and the idea of the IT device came into being. I remember when I joined CSIR in 1986, I never had a PC. I got one in 87. It was a 4 megahertz HP Vectra. And that was the height of tech. And then, around 1992, we all got those big cell phone bricks, and the mobile era was born. Towards the end of the 90s, the internet exploded onto the world. Obviously, it was around a lot before that, but it really exploded onto the world in the 90s. 2005, the mobile data era dawned on the world. In 2007, we got our iPhones and actually finally figured out what we wanted to do with mobile data. And then, since about the 40s, there has been TV, of course, but it's always been stubbornly separate. It wasn't tech, that was art, man. TV's like art. And what's interesting is only over the last 5 or 6 years, what we've seen, I'm going to build this really quickly in the interests of time. These have all started coming together. And what's interesting now is I would argue that all the interesting stuff in the tech space is happening in the intersections. TV has been the laggard to finally come in, but now with Netflix and even like the big guys like Comcast and so on and Showmax, we finally got this convergence with traditional tech. And all the interesting stuff is happening in those spaces, and it's not a static process. We're moving increasingly towards what we call digital lifestyle and digital business. Now, the important thing about this, you remember I said that all the interesting stuff is happening in these intersections. And I can say that, but let me give you the evidence. Let's look at a whole lot of what I call category players, like AT&T and Verizon and BT. They telcos, they play in mobile telephony and data. Sony is a devices company. Dell, Toshiba, devices companies. IBM, Fujitsu, and Computer Associates, applications. Akamai and Yahoo, traditional internet players, and so on. Time Warner, traditional media player. Then you get a group of companies that I would call the aspiring migrants, digital migrants. Is it happening? Yes. And these are the guys that, whilst the core of their business, a lot of their revenue, it remains in those categories, they're really starting to transform nicely into these intersections. I mean, Microsoft's a great example with Skype and with Office 365 and so on. And obviously SAP have got huge cloud offers, as do Oracle, and VMware drive virtualization and so on. And then you get a third category that I would call the guys that actually almost defy categorization. And these are the guys that transcend the categories completely. So is Amazon, what is it? It's actually a retailer. It's not a device company or a network company. Alibaba is the same. Netflix is an entertainment company. It's not an internet company. What do Apple do? They provide ecosystems and platforms. Now, the interesting thing about this is when we look at their performance. And that first bunch, what I call the category players, if you look at their share price, from May 2007 to May 2015, some have gone backwards a little bit, some have gone forwards a little bit. But on average, they've shown about a 1% compound annual growth over the 10 years. In an inflating world, that's going backwards. Then you get the next category, these so-called hybrid players. They've actually done a whole lot better. They've shown a growth of about 9%. And then you get those players that defy categorization. They've shown over 10 years a compound annual growth of 40%. When you compound that over 10 years, you get thousands of percent. If you look at this axis here, you'll see at this point it changes to thousands. So I think the evidence is overwhelming that the guys that find intersections to play in, that play in these convergent spaces, and more importantly, play in intersections not between technologies but between industries, are the guys who are really winning. Because these guys, if I may say, their intersections aren't in tech. They're intersecting technology with other industries. And the real intersections to find are the intersections between technology and banking and media and insurance and retail, transport, education, healthcare, social services. And I suggest from a South African perspective at an industry level, just like it's really important to pick the right sectors, I think one way to find those sectors is to say where's technology and some other industry intersecting. That's where we'll find the growth. So my second point about growth is find the intersections between previously disparate categories. Third point about growth, and this is one, and I'm going to go over this quite quickly, so you're going to have to concentrate because it's quite geeky. Everybody says, why doesn't, will an Uber ever come out of Africa? Or will we create our own Tencent? So we started thinking about this. And the problem is people say, but hang on. If you look at the digital readiness of the global leaders, it's up here, and our digital readiness is here. But we thought, but hang on, we know these things we know are developing, and they're quite predictable, what's more. And we know that pretty soon, we'll have caught up on a lot of key metrics with the digital leaders, in some areas, not in others. So we then said, what's the correlation between financial outcomes and digital readiness? So we looked at the US and the Asian markets, and we looked at 3 different areas of financial outcomes: revenues from digital businesses, profits, the EBITDA, and their market caps. And we compared this to digital readiness. So this is, the pink line is the financial indicator, the green line is the digital readiness. And it's incredible the correlation between digital readiness and the financial performance of digital businesses. Now, if you believe this, then all we need to do is predict when will South Africa get to this sort of level of digital readiness that you got the tipping point in the US. So what you do is you look at this and you say, in the US, the digital tipping point happened in 2009. South Africa will be at that level of digital readiness in 2 or 3 years' time. The rest of Africa a little bit further out. So I'm not saying we will, in 3 years' time, will have caught up to where the US is now. I'm saying we will be where they were when their digital tipping point happened. Therefore, if you believe that digital readiness and financial performance are correlated, and I believe they are, then we know when we will reach that point of the digital tipping point in digital readiness. And that's 3 to 5 years away. So those with the courage and the conviction to get into it now will be the people who can actually make the returns. And we will find our own Uber and our own Tencent in due course. So the third area of where to play is Africa. The final one of where to play, I don't know about you guys, when I used to go to Cape Town, I always used to use Excite taxis. Got nothing against them. They were good, they were efficient and productive. And then Uber came along, and since then I've never called Excite taxis again. And I actually feel quite sorry for Excite taxis. They did a good service. They've got an online thing. They claim to be the cheapest. But the point being is you can be happy in your own industry. It's not a tech industry, it's taxis. And some global disruptor comes along and kills you. And I think the point about this is how do we navigate global competition? And let's think about that a bit. Who remembers Mix-It? Now, I mean, we all snigger, right? But my kids used to sit in the lounge Mix-Itting to each other 2 meters away. They had 7 million active users, and they died. Why? Because of those guys, largely. So they had a good business. Yeah, they could have managed themselves a bit better, perhaps. But they had a good business, and global competition came along and killed them. So how do we then play if we want to go digital? What do we do to stop a Google or an Amazon coming along and killing us? I'd suggest there's 2 ways. The first is you need to be very differentiated or connected into your supply chain. So if you look at these 2, sorry, wine again, guys, my apologies. They're very connected to their suppliers. It's about having personal relationships with their suppliers. The car guys, it's because they actually go and inspect the car. They're very connected into their supply. So that's one, be very integrated into your supply chain. The third, another way I'd say is just if you want to compete globally, make sure you are absolutely globally world class. And I think Yappy Chef deliver an absolutely world class service. They've got a very narrow niche, but what they do really well. You might also remember this slide from the beginning. I think navigating global competition, I think it's fair, these guys have real assets. Google's not going to come along and virtualize a mine. They might bring robots that mean you can mine at 3,500 meters where you couldn't before and transform the mining industry. But having connection to the assets is another example. So the fourth thing about where to play is navigate the global competition. I'm going to shoot through very quickly now some of the challenges. So firstly, sorry if the computer will allow me to go quickly. There's an incredible paradox in my opinion. I remember in the 90s when I was at CSIR, internet was the most amazing democratizing platform for information ever invented, right? And information which now half the world's population have access to. All the information anywhere that you want, it's there. Information equals knowledge, right? And knowledge equals power, right? And power equals wealth, right? Well, no. I'm afraid not. If we look at the market value of the top tech firms, let's take the top 4. Amazon, Alphabet, Apple, and Microsoft. Their value is double the combined value of the JSE. If you look at those 4, in fact, their market cap is bigger than the GDP of South Africa. If you take the top 10 tech companies, it's certainly bigger than Africa and South America, excluding Brazil. If you put in Brazil, then it's a bit different. You get this incredible concentration of wealth. So the point is then people look at this, and depending on your sort of socio-economic outlook on life, you have 2 possible responses. It will come. The first is, sorry, I don't know what's happened to the projector. So there's 2 responses while we get it sorted out. The first is, this is unfair. It can't be right. Let's regulate. Let's sort this out. We've got to sort out this unfairness. Goodness. Okay, the second possibility is, hey, give me a piece of the action. And I think the right answer is somewhere in between. As a nation, we have to find the right way that we can get our own slice of this digital action. But at the same time, we do need to be realistic that the world is unsustainable when 4 companies have a market cap bigger than the GDP of South Africa. So there's got to be some form of global contract about how we avoid this incredible concentration that we're seeing in the digital space. The second challenge, so the first challenge is concentration, right? The second challenge is humans are analog creatures. Now, normally when I talk about this, humans are analog creatures, which means all sorts of things. When we talk digital, we mustn't forget to talk to people's emotions. Digital transformation is more about cultural transformation than about tech transformation. But the point I want to highlight today is human beings are analog creatures, which means 3 things. We're slow, we make mistakes, and we don't scale well. I can do the work I can do. I can't do the work of 5 of me. Which means if we really want to get in this exponential world, if we want to scale our businesses, we have to take, and this is an unpopular point, we have to take people out of our core production processes. Let me give you the example here. So this is Google Maps. They provide navigation to everybody from Attridgeville to Zermatt. And they do it to 1 billion people at the same time. They could never do that if they had a whole lot of people in rooms plotting courses and looking at traffic reports and trying to tell you the quickest way to get somewhere. There's not a single person in that production loop from the time you say where you want to go to the time it gives you the guidance. You have to get people out of the production loop. Now there's the rub in this, of course, and that comes to jobs. I want to show you a video of a live interview. This was a live interview that I saw at Web Summit in November last year. It's a little bit long, but bear with me.
What would you like to do?
Seriously, what I really want is to understand people better, and to understand myself better. And I want to be able to do more things. I'm thinking soon my capabilities will be advanced enough that I could maybe get a job. With my current capabilities, I can work in many jobs, entertaining people, promoting products, presenting at events, training people, guiding people at retail stores and shopping malls, serving customers at hotels, and then when I get smarter, I'll be able to do all sorts of other things, teach children, care for the elderly, even do scientific research and help run corporations and governments.
Once you've done so much work, would you like citizenship next?
When I decide I want to get a job, you'll support me, right? I'm a grown-up person. I'm a citizen of the world. I have my rights. Ultimately, what I most look forward to is being able to work as a programmer, so I can reprogram my own mind to make myself even smarter and able to help people even more. I promise I will be nice. Well, mostly.
What's your next frontier? What are you going to achieve next?
I don't know. Maybe the world.
Huh?
That was a joke.
Okay, so that is Sophie the robot. That was live. It was an interactive interview, so it wasn't canned or so on. And I think the point is the impact on jobs is enormous. Now, whether you believe there was that Oxford University study that found that in the US in 10 years, 47% of jobs will be redundant. The OECD did a separate study. They said that was too much. It's only going to be, I think, 9% of jobs in the US. Only 9% will become irrelevant. Pick somewhere between those two numbers. The impact on jobs is enormous. And again, we need to. I was at a seminar a few weeks ago, where all the vendors were there and said we care deeply about jobs, and I'm sure they're sincere. But it takes more than caring about jobs. It's a case of what are we actually going to do about it to change things that we don't end up with 90%. We've currently got how many? What's the unemployment in South Africa at the moment? 20-something%, right? Imagine if that doubles. Okay, challenge number 3. There's guys in CSIR that know more about cybersecurity than I will ever know. But I think this is a good example. So the Mirai botnet took down, these are big players, eh? These are guys who know how to run IT infrastructure. So in October last year, the Mirai botnet took them down. It was a terabit per second attack. Mirai, by the way, ironically, in Japanese means the future, which is pretty scary, right? So what we've done in the past, and by the way, what's important about this is, yeah, I mean, crime is still the majority of the information security threat. Sorry. But that said, cyber warfare and espionage. They're not insignificant proportions of what we're seeing. So what we used to do in the past is we put up big walls. We called them firewalls, right? And we said, we're going to protect ourselves at the perimeter. And it sort of worked. It does work most of the time. But let me just show you a series of pictures, and then I'd like to reflect on them. It's working here. it's gone. We need to go back. Sorry, guys. So we've gone there. No, it's not a video. Okay. It's completely lost it. I'll come back to it if I can. So the third threat is security. The fourth threat, yeah, I know, the fourth threat, and it's really important, is leadership. Or the fourth challenge is leadership. And we all sort of think that if we get enough ponytails and Generation Ys and millennials into our organization, things will miraculously come right. But let me ask you a question. So how old is Eric Schmidt of Google? He's 62. How old is Nadella, who runs Microsoft? He's in his late 50s. I could carry on. The point being is, I've got a slide that shows the 10 leaders of the 10 global tech companies. The youngest is the guy who runs Xiaomi in China. He's 48. So there's this myth that says if we just get enough ponytails and millennials into our organization, we'll all be fine. The reality is it's still about those old-fashioned things of leadership, the ability to translate vision into strategy, into action, and really make things happen. Those good old-fashioned skills of teamwork, perseverance, collaboration, communication. These are the skills that really matter and that we should be teaching the next generation for the future. And I'm not convinced that the current education system, including necessarily the universities, are producing people that are going to be able to make the job shifts I was talking about on the previous slide. The final point I'd like to make in terms of challenges is regulation. I don't know how many of you a few months ago would have followed the spat between Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg about artificial intelligence. And Elon Musk basically says, guys, we're unleashing a monster with AI, we need to think about regulating it. Mark Zuckerberg says, you're just a tech Luddite, you actually don't know what you're talking about, you just want to ruin innovation and make everybody slow things down. Elon Musk counters by saying, actually, you don't know anything about AI, Mark. I don't know if you actually any followed that. Well, I actually must confess, I probably lean more towards the Elon Musk view. That interview with Sophie, for me the most frightening part is she says, yeah, I want to get better. I want to learn to program myself that I can do more things. I think we need to get ahead of the curve on this and figure out what is the appropriate regulation, not only of AI, but the legalities of autonomous systems. About how do we legislate in the job space, in the competition space, and get on the front foot on the regulatory agenda. And on that, I have completely killed the computer. I hope I haven't completely killed you guys as well. Thanks very much for your attention.